Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Carly P. Riley Show. I am so excited for today's episode because I am talking about two things I love very much, which are the media business, the media world, and Harry Potter, which is, I would argue, the most powerful and important intellectual property that is out there today. And as part of the proof of this, today we are going to be talking about why and how it is the case that Harry Potter and its creator JK Rowling just have Warner Brothers Discovery by the balls. Warner Brothers Discovery, big movie studio, television studio, and they are just at the whim of JK Rowling and Harry Potter, which was described a bit in a recent Wall Street Journal article. In fact, David Zaslav, who is the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, when he took over as CEO of the company back like 2 years ago, one of the first things he did was to fly to the UK to meet with Rowling for many hours to really talk about how important she was and to talk about the future of the Harry Potter franchise within Warner Brothers Discovery. We'll talk about this. We'll give you the background, but Warner Brothers Discovery owns Harry Potter and has since the late 1990s. And according to people who were familiar with that conversation between David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, and JK Rowling, apparently Rowling asked Zaslav, how has it been taking over this major company and what are your ambitions with it? And Zaslav said, a big part of it is you. Like, you're a big part of our vision and what we see here. So that is our episode for today. We're going to talk about how and why J.K. Rowling has so much power and the state of things now, which will include talking about the Harry Potter TV show that has been announced for 2026. All right, so to really get into why Harry Potter is the most powerful intellectual property out there today, which I will abbreviate intellectual property to be IP throughout this video, we have to back up and understand a little bit more context about Warner Brothers Discovery in the first place. So Warner Brothers and Discovery were two separate companies until they merged about 2 years ago. And the argument for merging these two businesses was that, first of all, these were two companies that were very much struggling. Neither was doing particularly well. Warner Brothers was owned at the time by AT&T, the phone company, whose thesis for why they had wanted to own Warner Brothers in the first place was not working out. Things were not going well on that side. Discovery, in the meantime, is primarily a linear TV company. Studio. So meaning broadcast, cable, and in a world where that business model is dying in favor of streaming, Discovery was really struggling as well. Now, again, at the time, the thinking was streaming is the future. And secondly, that the real thing that companies needed in order to be able to compete with Netflix in the streaming game was scale. They needed size. So the idea for this merger between Warner Brothers and Discovery was, okay, if we become one new, bigger company, we'll be a more formidable opponent to Netflix on the streaming side because we'll have more content that we can package under one roof, under one streaming service. And, all the other stuff will have more synergies and we can do layoffs and we can blah, 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 all the things. So this is all to say that streaming was at the heart. Building a big, powerful other streaming company that can compete with Netflix was at the heart of the decision to merge these two companies. And it was at the time of this merger that David Zaslav became the CEO of these two companies. And it hasn't really worked. It turns out the thesis that was really prevailing 2 years ago around the idea that what you needed to compete in the streaming wars was scale may not turn out to be true. I mean, we're still writing this story in many ways, but Netflix seems to really have a lock on the scale piece. And so it seems like perhaps in hindsight, what these companies should have focused on was focus, was more a niche of content that they could really dominate and control. And merging two companies to just like throw a lot of different shit under a streaming platform definitely doesn't get you that focus that may actually make them more competitive. So the truth is, investors just haven't been very excited about this new merged company for a while. Upon the release of its most recent earnings report, which was a couple weeks ago, shares for the company fell about 10%. This is on the back of the idea that the company was going to be killing more of their shows, more of the movies, partly because they have a lot of debt, which goes back to the AT&T and Warner Brothers era. They've got a lot of debt, so they need to cost cut. But if they're cost cutting, it also means they're not able to invest fully into new content, new IP, new shows. So they're sort of in this downward spiral. They need to cost cut so that they can get a handle on their debt. But to get investors excited, they need their streaming service to work, which could mean investing more in content or at a minimum, not killing the content that you have planned to get out. So this gets us to number one. Warner Brothers Discovery needs more people signing up for their streaming service. And their primary streaming service is HBO Max, which, by the way, was renamed just Max, specifically on the premise that they'll get more subscribers if there isn't any sort of prevailing sense of what HBO stands for. Max is sort of this broader name, and so they might be able to attract more subscribers. That has not worked so far. But anyway, the idea is they need fundamentally more subscribers. And what brings in new subscribers to a streaming platform? It's not just any old TV show. It's not just having a lot of TV shows. People will subscribe to a new streaming service for a specific intellectual property they really want to see. And for the last 20 years, the most powerful kind of intellectual property that has existed in Hollywood are franchises. And I want to talk about this for a moment as well, because there's a really interesting history to the role that franchises have in the Hollywood system. There's obviously a joke that Hollywood doesn't make anything new, and everything that they're coming out with is like a sequel or a remake or in any number of ways unoriginal. But that wasn't always the case. Now, there's always been franchises. You have Star Wars and Star Trek and these really powerful franchise IPs that have existed for a long time. But the central, critical role they play in the economics of Hollywood really didn't begin until the early 2000s, when Bob Iger became CEO of Disney. And at that time, when Bob Iger took over Disney in 2005, he reorganized Disney's entire structure, their entire organizational structure, their financial structure, etc., to be built around the idea of building franchise intellectual property. So as part of this, he bought Pixar, the animation studio upon which they knew they'd be able to build franchises. He acquired Marvel Studios for the Marvel franchise. He acquired Lucasfilms, which controls Star Wars. And all of this was to say, this is what this organization does now. I have a friend who was hired as part of this to be the first head of live action studio franchise management. I don't know if I got that title exactly right, but the idea was his whole job was to manage certain franchises within the Disney brand. And what happened when Bob Iger made this move is within a few years, Disney was catapulted from like the number 4 studio in Hollywood in terms of profit and revenues and however you measure that to number 1. And all of the other studios in Hollywood had to start reorganizing themselves as well to follow suit. Now, John Rogers, my friend, who was the head of live action franchise at Disney at the time, he describes this as being an architectural innovation, a change to the way that business is done that is so fundamental, it causes other studios to sort of change the way they do everything as well. So another example of this would be the summer blockbuster. It used to be, many, many decades ago, studios would sort of evenly distribute their budget and resources across a number of movies that would come out all throughout the year, and that was the way things were done. And then starting in about the 1970s, a couple studios started to realize that if they put much more of their resources, their time, their energy into just a handful of movies, 1 or 2 movies maybe, that came out in the summer, they could actually drive a larger returns, that the crazy returns they could make on a really big summer hit were more than just having somewhat hits throughout the year and evenly distributing the resources. So that's another example of an architectural innovation where some change to the way that the business was structured occurred that forced every other studio to follow the model because of just how successful it was. So in the early 2000s, you have this shift to franchise IP as the biggest money-making thing in all of Hollywood. But not every studio has done it as well as Disney has. And we're going to get to that in just a minute because it is also a part of this story as to why JK Rowling is so freaking powerful. But the other reason that JK and Harry Potter, of course, are like truly the most important intellectual property right now has to do with some of the uniqueness of Harry Potter itself, which is that Warner Brothers bought the rights to Harry Potter, started buying the rights to Harry Potter. They didn't buy them all at once. They started buying the rights to Harry Potter in the late 1990s. For the 7 books that were written. And they had the rights to turn those books into movies. They were able to strike a deal with Universal to make the theme park. But generally speaking, Harry Potter is one of the only, I would argue, the only major intellectual property on par with Star Trek, Star Wars, etc., that has not been really oversqueezed. It has not burnt out its base with bad movies, bad products, too many movies like the Marvel franchise or DC. And we know this because when Warner Brothers Discovery released the Hogwarts Legacy video game last year, it very quickly became one of the best-selling video games. It's garnered over $1 billion in sales, and it's been a reminder to Warner Brothers like, oh my God, we're sitting on this gold mine. We have this property that hasn't been, unlike so many of the other intellectual properties, it hasn't just been wrung out, and its fan base isn't just like sick of all the content coming out around it. So we could really do something with this and it would matter to people. It would mean something to people because they haven't just tired from it already. So you have this perfect storm where you have Warner Brothers Discovery really needs new people signing up for its streaming services. The best way to get somebody to newly subscribe to your streaming service is to have an incredibly successful, guaranteed to be a hit show with an intellectual property that is a franchise that people have a lot of emotional attachment to. So they're almost guaranteed to be like, screw it, I'll pay. I just want to see what this is. And they happen to hold the last remaining like super A+++ franchise intellectual property that could do that, which is Harry Potter. So all of that gets to why they need Harry Potter so badly. But the problem is, this is not as easy as just one, two, three, make it happen. Because, as many people know, JK Rowling has negotiated for herself and successfully negotiated for herself an inordinate amount of power in the Harry Potter universe when it comes to Warner Brothers' rights. And this gets me back to the point I was making earlier, which is that not all of the studios have approached their franchise IP strategy as well as Disney has. Disney has a policy where they must completely own and control all of the intellectual property that they develop. And they finance it all themselves. They do all of it themselves. Their whole motto is like they're going to plan for complete success. Because if they make something and it's incredibly successful, they want to have total control over it in the end. But it also means that they're taking on more risk, because if the project fails, they're shouldering that burden themselves. Other studios have had a more risk-averse approach where they'll bring in outside partners. In many cases, that means like an outside financier to help co-fund, help co-finance a project so that if it fails, they're not shouldering that burden by themselves. But the byproduct of that is that they have less control over the IP that they develop. And so when they do have a hit, they often are much more limited in what they can do because they don't have total control over it. And of course, this is what's happened with Harry Potter. In that case, they don't have a co-financier for it, but they did take a more risk mitigative strategy, or JK Rowling just did an amazing negotiation job, or some combination of both, which is probably the case, so that JK Rowling has way more power than Warner Brothers would probably like in what happens in the Harry Potter universe. So they can't just go and make things. They have to run things by her. And so this gets us to where we are today, which is JK Rowling and Harry Potter are so important for Warner Brothers Discovery, for their future strategy, as David Zaslav apparently told JK Rowling in that early meeting. And yet the relationship between the two is complicated. As this recent Wall Street Journal article described it, it was described as more of a marriage where there's a real closeness because of how important and powerful this intellectual property is. But there's also a fraughtness to it at times. This Wall Street Journal article described meetings where there were tears and there's been screaming, and there's everybody has strong feelings about this relationship. And you have JK Rowling, where if you're a major Harry Potter fan like myself and you've watched hours and hours of interviews with her, you know she's always had a bit of a conflicted relationship around a Hollywood studio having power over her intellectual property. I think, she's British, Scottish. She doesn't love like the American capitalists, the idea that they would just have free reign over her story, and it approaches things with them, I think, with a what I would view as a very healthy amount of skepticism about what they're going to do and how they're going to do things. And then a few years ago, when JK Rowling started to tweet controversial things, and I don't want to get into that, but it's to say like that obviously has a part in this whole story. She really felt like Warner Brothers didn't do enough to back her and to stand up for her a bit, as she faced a lot of death threats and other things. And so that has also colored the relationship of the recent, 5 years. And as this Wall Street Journal article reports, the relationship, therefore, between Warner Brothers and JK Rowling had really started to cool a bit. And so it is in this context that David Zaslav, newly appointed CEO of this Warner Brothers Discovery mega company, flies to the UK to really make peace and repair the relationship between Warner Brothers and JK, because she is their strategy. She is how they get more subscribers. And apparently it worked. They had this 5-hour meeting, and clearly what needed to be done happened, because it has been announced that there will be a new Harry Potter TV show based on the first 7 books coming out in 2026. Now, I'd be very curious to hear how people feel about this. I'm personally really, really excited about it. I think that if you are a huge Harry Potter fan, the movies are shallow compared to the books in many ways. And so a TV show would be a way to build out the franchise, but in a way that stays very true to the creator's core vision. So anyway, that is our show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to know if you agree, is Harry Potter the most important intellectual property right now of anything, because it hasn't been overused? Are you a Harry Potter fan? Are you not? And if you did enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking, commenting again. And with that, I will see you next time.